delighted to have Professor Harvey Jacobs with us. He's a professor at the Department of Urban and Regional Planning, Gillard Nelson Institute of Environmental Studies, Madison. He's an expert on private property rights, social conflict over public regulation of property, public policy for private property, and has to his credit several achievements. So we're really happy to have you with us. Thank you for your time.
So thank you for being here. And our first question, which we understand is very critical for public policy as it relates to land, is that property right is at the cornerstone of all ideas relating to liberty, equality, and citizenship in most countries. And India has inherited a set of colonial laws that govern that kind of rights. Now, in this context, we would like to ask you about your based on your understanding of how such laws have evolved in different countries, and also the fact that in our country there has been a Forest Rights Act that tries to give different kinds of rights to the indigenous people versus the modern conception of right to property. So our question would be, how do you see this dichotomy operating in today's world, both in the United States and from your limited exposure to this country?
I guess the first thing I will say is that the experience in India of the alienation of property from indigenous people is one that was replicated by the British and other colonial powers during the colonial era. So this happened in Australia, New Zealand, throughout Africa, throughout Latin America, as well as through South Asia and Southeast Asia. So this was nothing new. And really what happened is the colonial powers often asserted that indigenous people did not own property in the way the colonials understood property to be owned. They often argued that because of the way indigenous people spoke about property, handled property, it clearly wasn't what they felt it should or could be, and on that they often laid a legal and political justification for expropriating it. So this act of expropriation and alienation was extremely common globally. I think that beginning in the middle of the 20th century, but really accelerating in the latter part of the 20th century, post-1970, post-1980, we've begun to see a global movement where I think it's a combination of several factors, and the net result of that is that there is now a global movement to engage in a reappropriation of land and property rights to indigenous people on continents throughout the planet. And so we have seen this quite successfully occur in Australia and New Zealand. It has been reasonably successful in northern Norway and Sweden with the Sami people. The Canadians have engaged in this. In the US, much more of a mixed record. And I think that throughout South and Southeast Asia and East Asia, we also have a much more mixed record so far. But the rationale for it is a function of, I think, in part colonial guilt, post-colonial guilt among new generations of what happened, new understandings of human rights on the one hand, and on the other hand, I think that indigenous people globally have either themselves become much more sophisticated in an ability to talk about land and property rights, or they have been able to link up with advocates who have been able to speak about it on their behalf. So I think we are seeing the Indian experience being part of a global experience, but it's a global experience with varying degrees of success in achieving some sense of fundamental social justice towards indigenous people.
The next question that I wanted to ask you about was the recent land acquisition bill, which has basically highlighted something that the government has been doing for a long time. That is, even if you do have title deeds to your property in peri-urban area, you can always be evicted by the government by coercion because they have that right to do so. So how do you see this situation playing out in India, and what are your views on it?
Well, I guess here I want to say several things, and I have become more acquainted about the controversy around the Land Acquisition Act during my time here, and have been asked by several of your colleagues in the program to read some material about it and consult with them on it. Several things that I want to say. First of all, the right of government to expropriate, and by that I mean to take land from an owner, even if the owner objects, is a very, very old right of government, very long-standing, and we see it as quite common globally, and especially common in the former English colonies, the English common law countries. So that if government wants to build a road or build a new highway to the airport, or build the airport, or build land for a school, or even land for a park, and an owner doesn't want to give it or doesn't want to negotiate about selling it, government has the right, fairly undisputedly, to take that land. There's no question about that. I think, however, that the controversy in India is actually part of a global controversy, and that is there something fundamentally different between government wanting to take land to build a road to the airport and government wanting to take land for an industrial corridor or a special economic zone? And here, I think there are legitimate arguments on both sides. I can really understand it from the point of view of the landowner and from the point of view of government. Government will often argue that if you look at the issue from broad public interest, from the jobs that will be created, the taxes that will be generated, doing this for an SEZ is as much in the public interest as building a road. From an individual's point of view, however, it looks very different to say to that person, we're taking your land for a highway, and to say we're taking your land to give to someone else who will own it privately and control it. So first of all, I think there is a difference between whether government creates and owns the SEZ or whether government uses that and provides the opportunity for private ownership within it. But even in that situation, there is very different feelings. And this is not just an Indian issue. We have had an extremely controversial instance of this, which went all the way to the U.S. Supreme Court in 2005 in the U.S. And this year, 10 years later, there's a whole set of new books and articles and conferences about the impact of the decision that was made by the court, which very surprisingly to many allowed government to take land for the purpose of economic development when it would be transferring land from one private owner to another private owner. So this is a U.S. issue, this is an Indian issue, it's a global issue. So that's one thing to say. I think the second thing to say is the question of if government is to be allowed to do this, how much should the owner be compensated? And I know this is part of the controversy also. And here, I think it's a function, we see a great deal more variability globally in the rules that government applies to the kind of compensation it will provide. So generally speaking, compensation is provided at current market value. Now, You can imagine a farmland owner in a peri-urban area who's compensated for agricultural value, but then sees extremely high value replacement use. There are countries that provide for some additional value, and I think there are ways to begin to think about this, which may provide further compensation. So I think there are really these two issues. One is the legitimacy of doing it, which I think can be understood from both sides. And then the second issue is the rate of compensation, which should be provided if it is going to occur.
Since we were speaking about the rights of people who have been evicted from the land, another interesting phenomenon that we see now is that with increasing urbanization, there's a lot of migration from the rural or the semi-urban areas into the urban areas, and therefore there is a huge population pressure that builds up. And the government tries its best to come up with a policy response to this kind of a scenario. However, they are clearly confused about what is the best method. Now, based on our understanding of the interactions we've had with you, you have dealt with this idea in many contexts. Now, our question is that the government, there is two divergent views. One believes that we need to give other kinds of rights, which include social rights and human rights, to these people, and once there is a certain development that happens in their human developmental scenario, that other property rights will follow. The other is to give them property rights first, recognize and regularize their settlements, and then the others will follow. Based on your own experience and your research interest, what would you recommend is a better method, or if there can be a combination of methods that could be used in Indian context?
Well, you are clearly asking one of the most complicated questions that globally right now in land policy, and that is really about what do we do about large communities of people rushing towards the city, many of whom find themselves in informal settlements. So we're not really concerned as much with people who migrate to the city and have the resources to acquire a flat, a parcel of land, and can relocate from one location to another. The issue really becomes, what about all these other people? And I think, again, we talk about India. I think the India case is similar and different globally. The rate of the percent of India which is urban is much below what the rate is globally, and yet globally we're talking about 1.3 million people a week moving towards the cities of the world, often the mega cities of the world, the Mumbais, the Delhis. And I think we are seeing something similar to this intensity of transition. I think that from my perspective, I think it is essential that there be some form of recognition of the legitimacy of these people in the urban areas, and that one of the ways that legitimacy is achieved is through a recognition of their right to be where they are. Now, is that a residency right, a property right, a usufruct right? We talk about it with different terms and mean different things in different parts of the world. But I think that if we go north and we look at mainland China and you ask the question, what's the population of Beijing? One answer is to say it's 12 million. But the real population of Beijing is 20 million. You have 8 million people living in unregistered informal status. You cannot sustain a global city with that kind of situation. So the Chinese are grappling with the question of how to regularize the existence of these people in Beijing and other cities. I think countries globally are. So I think we have to. exactly how we have to, I don't think there's one answer. I don't think it's, I can say, do it like this. I think we have to shape it to India, to China, to Indonesia, to South Africa, to Brazil, reflective of the legal systems, the culture, the customary laws of those places.